Awesome. All right, we are live. Exciting. But yeah, I definitely had forgotten that it was going to be Easter Sunday and just planning. I feel like working remotely makes me forget, the holidays because it's just like, oh, well, I'm home anyway. So,
No, all right. It's all right. I think, especially for those who may not be getting together with their families, this is something fun to do on Easter Sunday.
definitely. Definitely. So we have about 5 viewers already. Happy Easter to everyone listening. If you celebrate Easter, enjoy the holidays. If you are in the Bahamas, give us a shout. Let us know where you are, where you're viewing from, who you are, why
Yeah,
you're.
happy Holly too. I think Holly is coming up soon. If I don't know if I missed it or not, but I see um some some greetings going around. So I think Holly is coming up soon as well. If it's not like today, also or somewhere around these
Yeah,
Asian activities as well. I have some Indian friends, so yeah.
same. I had some Indian flatmates when I was living in the UK, so
Mhm.
I definitely enjoyed my fill of curry.
Yes. Oh God, yes. Indian food is amazing.
Awesome. So we have about 6 viewers, so we're going to get started. Like I said, this is the Easter Sunday. I don't want to keep you long or any of the viewers who are dedicated to watching this full episode. Welcome, everyone, to the season 3 finale of Siren Sundays, season 3. My guest today is Kelli Armstrong, and she's going to be talking to us about climate change. What's up with climate change? What is climate change? All the things that you need to know, especially non-conservationists, because it's definitely become such a buzzword, not even in conservation, but just also in the public. Everybody, when they hear climate change, they know that it's something to do with the environment and it's something they should be concerned about. So let us hear a little bit about yourself, Kelli. Let me know what some of your background is. Why did you pick to study climate change and all of the good stuff? Who are you?
Oh boy, love that question. So I'll start all the way from the beginning. It was September 1st, 1989. Just kidding. But yeah, so my name is Kelli Armstrong, and I am an environmental scientist turned climate and disaster risk management researcher. That journey would have started, I guess, a little early on in high school. I was really always interested in the sciences, didn't really know where I quite fit. The school that I went to was a small private school, and there wasn't really a lot of options for me to really explore all the different career opportunities available in science. So I actually went to Sunland Lutheran School, aka Sunland Baptist Academy in Freeport, Grand Bahama. My family was, from Nassau, Bahamas, but we moved to Grand Bahama. So I finished high school there. And then I came back to Nassau to start the University of the Bahamas. And funny enough, because I didn't know what to study, I kind of applied last minute because my guidance counselor told me I should apply to CUB, like out east. And I'm so happy that I did because that was kind of like, the impetus for like everything else that happened. But yeah, I applied to CUB and I know I wanted to do sciences and I thought chemistry was probably the coolest of the ones that I was exposed to. So for some reason, they let me in as a chemistry major, and I studied chemistry for 3 years at the University of Bahamas.
Oh, wow.
But it was actually in my second year when I took an elective. It was an ecology class with Professor Jacqueline Chisholm Lightbourne. Hey, Chiz. That really changed my life because her, not just her instruction and her teaching, but her field trips were probably like the highlight of my like college tenure. So we did like field trips, I think like every other week, and we'd like go to the Mangroves and visit other national parks and just like some of the pine forests out in like the Coral Harbor area. And I just really loved being outdoors. And I was like, oh, cool, I could do science outside. Like I don't have to be in the lab to be, the nerd that I really want to be. Like I can actually, you know, like engage outdoors and do cool field studies like in the bush and in the ocean. And that was like my first, I guess, realization that science was like so much more than just being in a lab or doing some sort of experiment, writing notes and things like that. So that was really cool. So at the time that I was actually a student at COB, then it's now UB, there was a Marine and Environmental Studies Institute. And at the time, it was actually ran by Dr. Kathleen Sullivan Seeley, who I'm sure most of us know and are very familiar with. So I actually got an internship there because I was interested in learning more about environmental science and ecology. And that was one of the institutes linked to the university that was doing research studies. There wasn't really any regular like marine biology classes or anything like that for me to get a little deeper into like the whole like broader environmental science realm of things as
Yeah.
a student. So that was probably my best bet, was to try to do some internships with Dr. Seeley, which I got to do. So that kind of allowed me to dive a little deeper into like the marine biology side of things, which is pretty cool because Dr. Seeley had a lot of things going on, still has a lot of things going on. So she was, and I think she still is, in charge of the coastal ecology lab at the University of Miami. So she had a lot of PhD students, Bahamian PhD students, switching back and forth, helping out with internships and different goings on under the university, as well as, you know, working in her lab, which is really cool because I got to benefit from that. So at the time that I was a student and doing an internship with COB MESI, we would have abbreviated as, at the time, Marine and Environmental Studies Institute. Um, I worked with some PhD students who were doing studies on lionfish and looking at different group respawnings, just looking at the landing. So we sort of were able to couple that with trying to establish a fishery database for the Department of Fisheries. So we went out, I think it was like once a month around the full moon every month for the summer that I worked on. And we just looked at the difference in catch around the full moon of Nassau grouper spawnings. And then we sort of tied those landings data along with, you know, if anybody did any lionfish sightings or if they have any lionfish catch, we'd measure them as well. So we kind of killed two birds with one stone, helping like 2 or 3 different PhD students with their data for their studies, which was really cool
Yeah.
because before that, I never really got to be like firsthand involved in any sort of research, let alone like, you know, PhD research. So that was very cool and very exciting. And again, I'm like a sophomore college student, so that was a pretty big deal. When I put that on my resume, everybody was, you know, that's a pretty cool thing to be involved in sophomore year, right, of
Yeah.
college. As a chemistry student doing marine biology, what led you into that? So yeah, so I like to tell that story too. So yeah, obviously I would have decided, okay, for real, like I'm gonna do environmental science. So at the time, the chemistry thing, there was only an applied associate of science degree at chemistry for chemistry at UB anyway. So once I finished the program, I would have transferred all of my credits to Katie University in Canada. So I was exploring different options to study environmental science. The Small Island Sustainability Study School wasn't a thing yet. This is back in, you know, 2009, I think, when I left COV. So I was looking at sorry.
I started to in 2009. Yeah.
Yeah, so cool. So yeah, all the cool things happened after I left. No, I just don't. But no, I wish, right? Or else I would have stayed a little longer. But no, it's cool. I'm still connected to the to everything that happened, and I'm glad I got that experience. But yeah, so I transferred my credits to Acadia University and I studied environmental science there. And while I was there, I also got very involved in student life. Um, so I guess just sort of being known in the student community, I always got, I guess, recommended for different opportunities. So the first thing I remember doing that was like not curriculum related was going to this youth leadership conference for sustainability. So we had to travel from Wolfville, Nova Scotia, where my school was, to Guelph, Ontario for this weekend-long conference. And there were only 2 students from each, selected from each university in the Atlantic Canada to go to this conference. And I was one of them. So I was like, you know, really excited, super excited. So that was fun. And I got to learn a lot more about sustainability, especially from like the circular economy perspective. So that really opened up my eyes a lot more. So that's kind of, I guess, where the whole sustainability thing became like very real for me. So that was really, really cool. And when I went to that conference, I was in the water group. So I got to make a lot of connections about the water system and, you know, people and education and all the different opportunities there are to just sort of close that loop. So that was really cool. And then I came back to the university and I started getting more involved in the environmental science students organization. So it's basically, you know, leaders from my cohort that were, you know, my fellow peers in my program. They had their own little organization and I became an executive of that organization. And I graduated from Acadia in 2012. In 2012. And then I came home and I was looking for a job everywhere and nobody wanted to hire me.
The
So
struggle.
yeah, so I was like, okay, this is real. Like this is I did not plan for this to happen. Like I came home with all this energy and I was so excited and I really wanted to, push some of my like ideas about sustainability, and a lot of things just didn't go as happened. So I was really back and forth between Grand Bahama and New Providence looking for work. Like I got offered a lot of internships, but at that stage where I had so much energy, I was like, and like I couldn't fathom like sitting through something that I wasn't certain was gonna move beyond like a few months, like I wanted to work. I was ready to work, right? So I was like, okay, these people aren't taking me seriously. I'm just going to go back to school. And that's what I did. So as you are aware, Bahamians Educated in Natural and Geographical Sciences is a really awesome group that posts a lot of opportunities, beings as we abbreviate it on Facebook. They post a lot of different opportunities for people to, expand their career, different scholarship opportunities to go off to school. And that's pretty much where I found mine. So big ups to Lino, founder of Beings, for starting that group, because again, that was definitely a huge milestone in my path.
Yeah.
So so yeah, there's an opportunity posted there for the Climate and Society program at Columbia University, full scholarship. I saw that it was in part sponsored by the International Federation of the Red Cross. So I immediately picked up the phone and called the Bahamas Red Cross Society here to see if they knew anything about it. And they didn't. They encouraged me to call, I guess like their headquarters or just call the school,
Right.
which I did. And I was actually able to find somebody who was able to talk to me and tell me about the program. They needed all of these requirements that I did not have. But I was like, I can agree and I'm really smart and I really have the will and the drive, We're like, okay, send in all of your requirements that you do have. And, of course, I had to write a compelling statement for them to accept me into the program. But at the end of the day, yeah, that worked. Yeah, that worked. So a year later, on the anniversary of my graduation from Acadia University, I got accepted to Columbia University for my master's program. So that was a big deal. And super excited. That program was a year long, so no breaks. It ran straight from August to August. And then I was required to do an internship for the last few months. So that was really cool. I studied climate and society, which is really just studying impacts on climate and society. And you do a lot of courses where there's a lot of flexibility in the program. Really, it's a Master of Arts program. Mm-hmm. So while I would have done things like quantitative methods in natural disasters, which is basically a statistics course, you also get a lot of opportunity to do some really cool electives. So I took electives like disasters and development. So understanding the impact of disasters on development and how hard it is for countries to recover from disasters. And I think, courses like that really help me to understand and I guess sort of empathize with the government and what they're going through now with Dorian and of course the pandemic, because I understand the processes that have to be in place, the policy development that has to take place, the regulations that need to be enforced in order for you to really be able to say that you effectively recover from this, right?
Yeah.
So that was really interesting because my professors were also people that have lived through disasters as well. So they weren't just talking, theoretically or, from some academic abstract, right? They lived through disasters. And so that was really insightful. And I got to take some really cool GIS courses for infrastructure development. And then I also took a class on ethics and values and sustainability, which was definitely my most favorite elective. I really bonded with that professor and we had some very interesting intellectual conversations about ethics and values in development. So that was a really cool experience and they liked me a lot. So I got an opportunity to work with them even after I graduated. So during my program, I was afforded a graduate research assistant position at the Earth Institute, specifically the International Research Institute for Climate Society, which we just abbreviate IRI. So I worked with the financial instruments sector team there, who is more well known for their index insurance design schemes. But I actually worked on putting together this database on forecast-based disaster preparedness in the Caribbean. So I'd essentially look through all of the disasters in the Caribbean, whether they were the weather related ones, whether they were due to droughts, floods, hurricanes, etc., heat waves over the last, let's say, 40 years, and just put together a database of that information, and in particular, focusing on which actions were driven by forecast knowledge, for
Right.
example. So if you know a forecast is coming and a disaster manager has to make a choice and they use a forecast to make that decision, like what sort of drove them to like put so much trust in these forecast materials, and just there's a lot of different offshoots that were related to the work that I was doing. But one of them is also trying to figure out, what makes disaster managers trust, or, establish some sort of trust with forecasts, and like how long do those forecasts windows of forecasts like have to be. So for example, we usually rely on weather forecasts when we're looking at hurricanes. We say, okay, the hurricane is here, we have this nice forecast cone over the next couple of days, and we can say, okay, so this is the path that is going to take, and everybody sort of understands right now like what a forecast cone sort of means.
Yeah.
But you had a forecast that was, maybe looking at a week-long window or a 2-week-long window. Like, do you have any trust in that type of forecast product, or maybe even 2 months? And maybe it's not necessarily for hurricanes, but maybe example like for a drought, then obviously, right, because a drought is a slower onset phenomenon and you can predict it a lot better, and that's understood.
Yeah.
But if you're just looking at rainfall forecasts, like what makes you sort of trust that forecast, and is it really accurate, and why not? And those are things that people actually very diligently work on like every year. But I digress a little bit. So anyhow, I was doing some really cool stuff, gathering a bunch of data together for lots of different purposes. A lot of the other teams that we worked with at IRI never really worked in the Caribbean. They worked in other regions like Asia and Africa and Europe. But I was basically doing something that was kind of really on the pioneer front for their work in the Caribbean, in terms of bringing this database together and sharing it with them so that they understood, I guess, what the baseline was in terms of, weather extremes, and what can we do to help disaster managers based on, looking at the forecast products that they currently use to help them make those very critical decisions, and how we can make them better.
Right.
So it was cool. And then, so I worked with them for a year after I graduated with my master's, and then I returned home. And before that, I would have interacted quite a bit with a company back at home who was very interested in me working with them, because they knew of the work that I was doing with UB and at Acadia, and we really wanted to work together. But at the time, I just couldn't commit, because the work at Columbia that I was doing was just, full time. Like I really didn't have time to commit to anything else. So when they heard that I was going home, they were really excited, and they offered me an interview. I sent them my resume and stuff, and they hired me right away. So I had like no, yeah, right away, right away. So that was fun. That company was Caribbean Coastal Services. The directors were Scott Blackier and Carlos Palacios. So shout out to them. Caribbean Coastal Services no longer exists, because we would have grown and sort of merged Caribbean Coastal Services along with our sister companies, Enco Bahamas and Atometrics, into what is now known as Braun Limited.
Right.
So I still work with that group, and it's been 5 years now, going on 6 years that I've been with that group. And I was originally hired as an environmental scientist, but then they found out about all of my other skills, and now I'm a project manager for the group of companies. But I still do quite a bit of environmental field work. We have a whole environmental team now. I was the first environmental scientist that they hired. They were mostly engineers.
Yeah.
We have environmental scientists, we have architects, we have surveyors, we have, a whole support team now. So we can do a lot of technical field work, designs, straight through like, management of construction. We mostly do like development consulting.
Okay.
So we carry you through the whole that process in terms of like environmental approval, straight through your Ministry of Works permits to get you through to construction, which is really cool. So Yeah, so I work with them now, and I still do quite a bit of environmental field work. But we have a whole environmental team. Shout out to the environmental team at Braun.
Mhm.
Um, and for the most part, the only thing that I do that's probably unique is the climate stuff, right?
Okay.
Like you said, climate is sort of like a buzzword these days, and it's not just because of Dorian. It's because like on the in the global scheme of things, like climate change has been creeping up on everybody,
Yep.
and so we're all talking about it a lot more. And we realize that we're pretty vulnerable in terms of climate extremes, not just hurricanes, but also things like, our water management is something that we seriously have to continue to consider. Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
big one, right? Yeah, we have to consider moving forward, understanding that even that resource will become severely affected by climate extremes, not just climate change, but even just climate variability, right? Like
Yeah.
things like happen, on a regular basis, depending on, what climate phenomenon is happening.
Mm.
But yeah, so those are things that we have to look at, and the government is definitely catching on to the hints from the global community. You see, well, from my work, I can tell, right? They're catching on to a lot of hints from the global community. You see a lot of these infrastructure development projects that come from ministries like the Ministry of Works when they send out tenders
Yeah.
to do different like consulting work, which is the type of tenders that we typically respond to at Braun. Um, you see them requiring climate risk and vulnerability assessments, and so that's the type of projects that I'm typically involved in, and they're typically transport infrastructure projects, but still like the theme is, you can see the theme is definitely catching on, and it's becoming a requirement for projects. So I don't expect it to be much long before DEP has a similar requirement like embedded in their environmental impact assessment regulations, for example. um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's just, I guess, a little bit on my path and my journey. And it's really interesting because I never really set out to be in this niche.
Mhm.
But I had a pretty exciting journey to this point, and it continues.
Yeah. From chemistry to climate change.
Yeah, why not?
For some of our viewers, because like we said, climate change has become this buzzword, and I oftentimes think that people don't really understand, what that means, because we shifted from saying global warming, which of course was wildly inaccurate to say. So can you just quickly, for the audience and even a bit for me, what is climate change anyway? What is it?
Sure. So, based on our industrial activities, which are mostly fossil fuel based, we have increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to the point where the layer, the natural layer of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is becoming thicker and thicker over time, which is not healthy because the thicker it becomes, the more heat it traps,
Yep.
which is why we at first called it global warming, right? But the reason why global warming, we can't say global warming all the time, right? The impacts of global warming is climate change, because some places aren't necessarily going to get warmer. Some places are actually going to get cooler, right? And
Mm-hmm.
there are lots of other different impacts because of that, due to what we call um, teleconnections. That's what a phrase that we use to describe the relationship between the ocean and the air. Due to atmospheric teleconnections, the ocean absorbs a lot of heat from the atmosphere. And so we see a lot of impacts in our oceans as a result of that as well. Of course, in the Bahamas, the top or surface layer of the ocean has always been very warm. But the deeper you go, obviously, the cooler you get. And that's provided a lot of relief from marine species from heat stress.
Yeah.
But when you think about sessile organisms like corals that can't move, that top layer of the water is becoming hotter and hotter as the air becomes hotter and hotter, and they can't swim to deeper waters like the fish can to get relief from heat stress. Yeah, I listen, I love that term teleconnection. I was like, teleconnection, okay,
Yeah, when you
atmospheric.
said it, I was like,
No, it's fun.
teleconnection.
Yeah, yeah. I trust me, from the first day I heard that word, I've used it ever since. I like that word, or phrase rather, atmospheric teleconnections. So so yeah, like for example, our corals, they become bleached, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what they do when they're stressed out by the heat. And unfortunately, just like a person, if you keep getting sick, you're really vulnerable to death, right? Because like how often can you become sick and ill before your body just, you don't really have much defense anymore.
Yeah.
Your body just becomes weaker and weaker until unfortunately you die. So that's what we're seeing happening with a lot of our corals. Reef death is becoming, unfortunately, observed more and more. And that's not good because we know coral reefs provide a host of environmental benefits, cultural benefits, economic benefits, and yeah, it's a real serious thing. It's very saddening when you really think about it because you have to also think about like what's the alternative. Being in a small country from the Bahamas, we know we don't have a lot of industrial activities, even though a lot of our habits and practices sort of contribute to the issue.
Yeah.
Um, because we depend on a lot of imports, and a lot of our imports are fossil fuel based products like our plastics, which thankfully are banned now, but still there. We are really heavy on like our fossil fuel ran cars, right? Everybody has a car. Like you can pull up to the average house where children probably still live with their parents, and there are like 6 cars parked in the yard, right? Like we're not big on like ride sharing and things like that, but those are things that can help, right, reduce our emissions because they are calculated, right? Like we submit reports regularly to the UN about our impact on this global phenomenon.
I don't
But
think people know that. I think a lot of Bahamians feel like, we are an island, right? When it comes to the global scale on things, like who are we really being held accountable by, and it's funny that you say that. We're sending reports to the UN. Like,
yes,
I,
we're a member to a few of the conventions and treaties, including the UN Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as a member of that treaty, we have to produce reports on these things. But again, we understand that even though our contribution is not great, we unfortunately suffer most of the impact. Right. We unfortunately suffer most, and if not most, definitely the worst, right, of the impact because we're an island country. We're super vulnerable, not just our economy, but just because of our like physical location, right? Just because of our topography, we're low lying, we're small, right? Our water resources are extremely vulnerable because they're also very close to the surface. So when we have, inundation, whether it be from storm surge, our water fields, our aquifers typically get contaminated with salt water. We call that, salt intrusion. So yeah, we have to be very careful about how we plan for sustainable, resilient development, understanding that climate change is just going to be an issue as years go by that's going to become worse. So we have to prepare now.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that a lot of people always tend to ask, which I'm going to ask you now, and sorry if it's like throwing you off your game. I know a lot of people wonder, can we reverse? Like, is there a way to reverse what we've done? Or at this point, is it about trying to slow down the progress of where we're already at and, delay what is inevitable, basically?
Mm-hmm. Like when you say reverse, you mean reverse the impacts or reverse in terms of like go back and do like things that are more sustainable in terms of, our habits and practices, like things that we weren't doing before industrial times, like just don't do them.
See, well, and you know what? I guess so both, right? But initially, yeah, that whole reversing the impacts. Like now that there's so much greenhouse gases, can we take greenhouse gases back out the air? Like, what are some of the things that we can do to, because what climate change mitigation, right? Like to now start like lessening the impacts that are already in place.
Right. So I guess yes is the short answer. We can. Unfortunately, I'll just start with the bad news first. There's a lot of climate change in the pipeline, which means that based on the things that we've already done to our environment. Yes, Lindsay, it is. I'm coming. Restoration is key. But yeah, based on what we've already done, the harmful impacts that we've already done to the environment, there's a lot of things that are in the pipeline, a lot of impacts that are in the pipeline that we won't be able to reverse because it's already done, right? In terms of the amount of greenhouse gases we pumped into the atmosphere, it doesn't mean, because we pumped out, because we drove our car from east to west today, that emissions are gonna reach the greenhouse gas layer tomorrow, and we're gonna have, coral bleaching in 2 weeks. It's not that, right? It takes a lot longer, right? Like the whole impact of climate change, in terms of where we are now, like this is over hundreds of years, right? Industrial times are like from 1800s, right? So this is hundreds of years of damage. And it's only gotten worse as the population has increased, and we've let unsustainable development just sort of run for so long. Only in like maybe the last, 50 years, I'd say, we really started to become super conscious about, yeah, right, there's lag in these impacts, right? And especially the severity of them, right? And don't forget,
with the
there's
hashtag.
and there's like a synergy in terms of the negative impacts as well. But it's only like really within like the last 50, 60 years that we really become super conscious, like with the green movement, about like the impacts on the environment based on these practices. So you got to give us time to fix it, right? If it took, in terms of our realization of the problem, it's only been within the last 50 years, but we've been doing these things for the last 300 years, right? So give us some time to fix it. We're working on it. I won't go as far to say that we're doing the best that we can, but we're making progress. And yes, there are a lot of things that we can do. Lindy touched on a great one, right? Restoring our habitats is definitely key, especially in the Bahamas, where, a lot of our habitats are very sensitive, but they're also very good at protecting us from some of the worst impacts of climate change. For example, I really love to highlight, and I think mangroves have recently been officially put on the new list of protected trees and plants.
Yeah.
So mangroves are awesome, as everybody knows, right? Right? And I love to highlight the story when people ask about like restoration and hurricanes and things like that. The story of the two fishermen from Andros who sought refuge in the mangroves, in the keys between Abaco and Grand Bahama. They rode out Dorian in the mangroves. All right? 2 men, nothing else. All right? They had nothing else. They were on a fishing trip. They heard bad weather was coming. It wasn't safe for them to try to turn back and go to Andros. So they rode it out in the mangroves. Okay? Mangroves protected 2 human lives. Those are 2 souls that were saved in just for them seeking refuge in the mangroves.
Yeah.
The 2 days, their wives were so afraid because, of course, they heard about all the devastation in Grand Bahama and Abaco from Dorian. They couldn't find them. They hadn't heard from them, and they returned home safely. So that's amazing, because we always think about mangroves and we think about their physical impacts on the shoreline. And we know that, they're able to help with break up a lot of the wave energy, which protects us further inland. But they also protect human lives, and that's so cool. Like, I wish that was a bigger story than it was, but I love to highlight that one. That's just one example, right?
Right.
And I've had a few conversations lately about that, because I think that also highlights something instinctual in them, where, our ancestors wouldn't have had the type of infrastructure that we have now, homes made of concrete and all of this stuff, where we like to typically hide away in when there's a threat of a storm. All they had were caves and mangroves, and they knew that they were safe places to be during a storm.
Yeah.
And I think those are the type of things that we need to continue to rely on. So we have to do a little bit better at passing down this traditional knowledge in these non-traditional ways that we keep evolving, right? In terms of how we communicate and interact with each other, and share information about what is proper or adequate or appropriate disaster risk management. Because if you don't have, and especially now where like people are still suffering from homelessness even, right? After Dorian. That is a very important thing. Like, hurricane season is not far away. Not May. I'm thinking about wet season. June to November every year. Like,
not another month yet.
I don't think most people realize that we have hurricane season half of the year, every year, right? That's very important information, because if you're living in your car, where do you roll up to in the middle of a storm? I'm not saying don't go to a shelter, right? I'm just saying you have other options, because even shelters can become compromised, right?
Yeah.
It's good to know that your natural environment is able to protect you if you need to, right? So we have to make sure that they're healthy, and a lot of them are not. So that's where these restoration projects come in. That's why they're so critical.
And I see some questions coming in. I'm gonna pop them up. Yes, thinking about water quality and freshwater systems. How can sea level rise, storms, and climate impacts be mitigated? Thinking of Grand Bahama, and how can we build back better to protect freshwater? When Mallory lived there, she used to drink the tap water through a Brita filter, but a lot has changed. Water is life. So what can be done? How can we build back better to protect the freshwater resources?
Sure. So one of my mentors is John Boleg, who is a long time consultant for the Water and Sewage Corporation. Shout out to John. And I know that he's worked on a lot of different projects where we're trying to make our water systems a lot more resilient. Obviously, this wouldn't apply to Grand Bahama because you have the Grand Bahama Water Company in Grand Bahama, but of course, if it works and it's applicable, then by all means, this is something that we should scale up, right?
Right.
But one of the things that they did was they actually raised the elevation of their wells. And they got some funds from multilateral organizations, development organizations, to assist with that project. So here in Nassau, that's one of the things that they did was elevate the wells so that if the area where the wells were became inundated, they didn't necessarily have to become flooded or contaminated, where the water actually went down, the salt water contamination actually went down, the wells are infiltrated. So that's something simple, but again, it's super critical to protecting our fresh water resources. And then again, even when you think just about the installation of those wells, especially if it's in a low-lying area, which most of the Bahamas is, right? You would want to elevate that area and make sure the mouth of your well is also elevated. So things like when we just think about accessing the resource, and elevating the water isn't just about the flooding, but when you think about the intrusion, it gives it a lot more time to trickle that water down naturally through the soil and other matter on the ground into that resource. So you protect it for a little while longer as well, right? So that's just one simple thing. I'm not a water systems expert, but I know that things are definitely happening, and and that's just in terms of the natural freshwater resource. But we also have to get a little bit more serious about conserving our water. Like, I know, again, from the perspective of water and sewage, and just hear them talk about their issues with our consumptive behaviors with water. Like, we act like it's a free resource because it was for a long time. Like, the Water and Sewage Corporation didn't really, well, they don't charge consumers like the actual price for water. The government subsidizes it extremely heavily. So because we're not paying a high water bill, because we're not paying actual water bills, because the government is paying a pretty hefty part of it, we don't really appreciate it. Of course, that's environmental economics. I don't know if just paying a higher bill would make us appreciate the resource a little bit more. But for those of you who may not know that and you can appreciate that connection, maybe you will, right?
Yeah,
because
I didn't know that. I actually had no idea.
Yeah, water is a scarce resource. Like, let's not pretend it is. And it takes a lot of energy to clean that water, right? And prepare that for you to make sure that it's safe for you and your family to eat, to drink, to bathe, right? Because don't forget, our exposure isn't just through the food we eat or drink, but also like you take a shower every day. Like, that's your skin, and you notice very quickly when you have issues with your water quality, because your skin will break out in no time, right? So it's very important for us to conserve that resource as best as possible as well. So yes, climate change mitigation is important, but also realizing that our consumption habits may not be the best. I know, for example, like when I used to do internships when I was in school with when I was in college with Dr. Seeley, when we'd do like field work with her, like she wouldn't allow us to bathe in hot water, and we can only take like 5-10 minutes max. Like back in the days, like I had hair down to my hip, so if I had like a regular shower, 5 minutes. If I had to wash my hair, I thankfully was graciously given 10 minutes, but I couldn't use hot water. Like, we were very conscious about those types of things.
Definitely. Yeah, you have to be. But yeah, I am being mindful of the time. We do have 2 more questions actually. So here, how best can we as a small nation help our larger neighbors to understand and care more about the impact climate change has on us here in the Bahamas?
Yeah. So no, I definitely think that's important too. Definitely, I'd say, I guess from a political standpoint, let's all continue to encourage each other
Yeah.
in keeping with our nationally determined contributions. So those are essentially the promises that we made to the UN about how we're going to combat climate change as a country, right?
Right.
But we can work together on a lot of those contributions. And there are a lot of opportunities for us to um, work together with other countries, especially in the Caribbean region, right?
Right.
We tend to operate a lot from a position of weakness, but there's a lot of strength in, and I'm alluding to a certain article recently in the paper that said CARICOM is not dead, and it's not, because a lot of my research actually involved me physically traveling from New York when I was at Columbia University studying and working two different islands in the Caribbean to personally interview disaster managers about best management practices and
Nice.
things that use and triggers that have helped to save lives, right? And there's a lot of knowledge there. There's a lot of knowledge there that's not effectively captured and shared throughout our community. And things like that, I think more conversations like this, right, Lashati? More
Right.
conversations like this need to be had across sectors, right? Because one sector doesn't have the answer for their resource either, right? It's going to take us realizing a lot of the interconnectivity between our resources and our systems, just like an ecosystem, right? When you have a particular habitat operating, you don't just look at one particular species. You have to see how that species is interacting with the abiotic and biotic resources in its community to figure out, you know, what it may need to thrive, not just survive. You want it to thrive. So we have to work. We really have to work together and encourage each other and share lessons. And I think that's probably the best and easiest way to do that. We have to share more. Like a lot of us, we tend to withhold a lot of knowledge and data and resources, and that's not cool. It's not cool at all, right? Like we pay for a lot of resources, and still don't get to a place where, you know, if we actually were able to like pick up the phone and call somebody who had that information, they would just willingly give it to us if it was in their power to. So I think we have to revert back to things like that. Just being able to communicate with each other a little bit more openly and willing to share data and other resources is going to be extremely, really helpful.
Yeah. And there's Karen
Yeah.
agreeing. Definitely. So I do see there's another question, but before I get to that one, because I had a similar question for you. One of the things that I wondered, or maybe I can tie it in, because this person's asking, how can people get involved, right? With companies and organizations who are doing this type of work. How can someone like myself get involved with or directly with like companies or organizations that work to raise awareness or counteract the impacts of climate change? Any advice for persons interested in a postgraduate education in environmental science or management?
Absolutely, lots of advice, man. Like, fortunately, first because I've been able to work with so many amazing environmental scientists,
Mm-hmm.
I guess other like professionals in the community here in the Bahamas, there are a lot of opportunities actually, right, to get involved in that type of work. There's a lot of things going on, not just like directly, but also indirectly that tie in with climate change. So I can start with some of the indirect ones. A lot of our nonprofit environmental organizations, whether it be Bahamas National Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Friends of the Environment, like name it, like they're all doing something, and they have programs that are being run that are funded by international agencies or just nationally and internationally, persons that will tie into their themes of climate change and just overall sustainability and conservation. So if you're interested in working with them, I definitely say reach out. Sometimes opportunities are not always advertised, but it's always good to just make sure that you're on their radar, they understand what your skill set is, and just shoot your shot. You know what I mean? When
Definitely.
opportunities come up, you'll be the first on their list, right? But yeah, definitely reach out to those organizations. They're always working on something very cool and interesting if you are really, you know, interested in that type of work. And also like volunteer, like if you have the time, of course.
Yeah.
you don't necessarily have to jump right in terms of like working with them. There may not be the opportunity for that at that time. But again, if they're familiar with you and your skills and they understand the value that you can bring, as soon as there's an opportunity, you'll be the first one in line, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely volunteer. Definitely. I mean, give them your money too, right? Like they need money. Give them your money too.
Not only with your time, but with your finances.
You need money for projects. PIMS as well, right? PIMS. I mean, there are so many other organizations all across the Bahamas. CC Bahamas, right? Cat Island Conservation Institute is probably the newest one on the block.
Yeah.
Exactly, Karen. This is what I'm talking about. Exactly. So, but yeah, they're all doing really great, amazing work. And then we all know CC Bahamas is also run by, you know, young marine explorers. They do a lot of community and citizen science trips and activities. And I saw recently in a recent article they're going to start certifying community scientists, which is amazing because I'm huge on certification. So make sure you check out. Yeah, it's really important for your like professional development, right? And it's easy for people to recognize you like that. But yeah, man, like I've worked at BNT. Before I had like a little stint between being at the College of the Bahamas and Acadia University. I worked at the Bahamas Cultural Trust as an education officer, assistant education officer, and I got to travel with them and help out with workshops in Family Islands. I had an amazing time. I was only there for like 2-3 months, but amazing experience.
Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've worked with a lot of local professionals on different projects with Caribbean Coastal Services. Yes, exactly. Hey, Lindsay. That's where I met me at BNT.
Same.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and then it's funny enough too, because like most of the environmental team at Braun also has very strong connections and relationships with Bahamas National Trust too. So I mean, just as a environmental professional, like you kind of might get looked up and down if you don't have a relationship with BNT. And you don't have to work there, but like if you don't have a relationship with anybody there, like that's like number one thing to do. Make sure you have a relationship with BNT. There's a lot of great resources there, in person, and just projects, programs. Yeah, but that's cool. And then also what we can do, like I know it seems like such a daunting thing because climate change is like, this global existential issue that everybody has to figure out how to deal with. But again, we don't have to do with it on our own. There's a lot of resources out there. We can synergize a lot of, activities that we're doing. For example, like one of the things that I'm involved in right now, I was selected to be a climate ambassador by the Global Youth Climate Network for the Bahamas. So that's cool and fun. We're actually preparing right now a position paper on climate action. So this is basically like young people from all over the world are putting their voice forward in terms of what they think the world should be doing in terms of climate action. And while that may sort of help to build on, again, some of the nationally determined contributions from other countries, it's also going to come from, just their own ideas as well, which I think is awesome and amazing because we've proven over time that, we understand the issue and we understand what needs to happen in order for it to be addressed. And we understand that in terms of the political movement, it's not fast enough. And so we're putting our voice there and we're demanding a place at the table and we're going to take charge of some of that responsibility, understanding that, the older generation is passing this buck on to us, but we don't have to accept it as is. We can actually do something about it. But just in terms of like individual and community action, like some things that you may consider so small and insignificant really aren't, right? So just, for example, thinking about on a daily basis, for example, like I live out east when I work out west, right? I really have to consider because like I am very conscious about like my carbon footprint.
Right.
When I move in the day, right, from my house and I know I have to go out west and return home, like I make sure I'm not like driving up and down Nassau all day. Like I'm gonna make sure like I have like any stops as I go out west. They're either made on my way to work or on my way from work. And like after when I get home, like I'm not coming back out.
Right.
I'm not like so just thinking about my personal carbon footprint, right? Because my car is run on fossil fuel. When I go out into the field and your phone dies or some other small device, maybe like a handheld camera dies, I tend to travel with a small, like it's a cell phone sized solar charger. and I would use that while I'm in the field because I'm exposed to the sun all day, right? To charge my mobile devices instead of using electricity. So that also helps because I get to use it while I'm in the field, even though my battery is dead, because I'm able to charge it right away. But then again, I'm also not using electricity from some wall outlet at the wherever the places that I'm staying. I'm helping to cut my carbon footprint again by using renewable energy.
Yeah.
And then even food choices. So as part of my commitment as well, being again a little bit more conscious about my carbon footprint for the duration of my climate ambassador program, like Miss Graham, I'm not eating any red meat.
Nice.
So I understand that red meat takes a lot of energy to produce and process for our consumption. So I'm having withdrawals. I'm not gonna lie, right?
Really?
I love a good juicy steak and I love a good burger, but I am committed to not eating any red meat. Oh, and curry goat, yeah. But I'm committed to
That's the
not
one.
eating, I'm committed to not eating any red meat at least until the end of October. But I may make that a larger commitment because I understand, especially as an ambassador, right? Like
Yeah.
I have to be an example. Um, and then just as a community, like part of it is also understanding like your community's vulnerability. Like if you live in an area that's floods, like when it rains for like 10 minutes, you may want to seriously think about what you need to do to further protect your community, because if you have a major flood event or a hurricane and you're impacted by storm surge, like what will your community look like after that, So I definitely recommend people to get together, especially if you already have some sort of association established in your neighborhood. You can use that to build some sort of responsible climate action activity. You can plant trees in your community. If you have a park, you can call up Bahamas. Is it Public Parks and Beaches Authority? I'm sure they would love you to plant some trees on the park. Just
Yeah.
organize an activity with them. And also, you may want to think about like your storm drains. I think another lesson that stood out from my interviews with disaster managers across the Caribbean is that we don't clean our storm drains as often as we're supposed to throughout the year. They get clogged up by a lot of debris that's from the street. And then when you have flood events and storm events, that debris is obviously hindering the water from collecting into the storm drains, and that's why a lot of our communities end up being flooded. So that may be something worthwhile to
Say that.
investigate. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that one bit on downtown that floods, and it's always because the storm drain hasn't been cleared out. And it's always so frustrating having to just drive after like heavy rain because you never know which area on the island is flooded.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
Precisely. So things as simple as that is putting our storm drains on a regular maintenance schedule. But there are private companies that will come and clean it as well. So maybe that's something that, your neighborhood association needs to organize. And then obviously as well, you could also think about preparing an adaptation plan. There was this organization called Carib Save. I don't think it exists anymore, but it's tied to the Caribbean community as well, CARICOM as well. But their resources are still available online. They've developed climate change adaptation plans for communities in Abaco, I think a community in Abaco, and I think there's another Family Island community. But that's something that you can do together. And if you need guidance, you can of course call me. But I'm sure like that, those are the types of things that we can work together on with people like CC Bahamas, right? But that'll be a fun exercise, and I'm sure I can get a lot of my other fellow environmental scientists involved in, and we can come up with a plan for your community to help protect it against some of those impacts. And again, it's not just about climate change, but the variability, right? Climate change impacts are going to be a little bit more slow onset when you think about things like sea level rise, right? But yes, due to the impacts of climate change, we are seeing more frequent, stronger hurricanes. We are also seeing drought, right? That's another creeper that people may not be so aware of, which is why, noted before, we have to protect our water resources as well and be a little bit more mindful about how we consume them. But yes, these things are always going to be relevant. So, let's start working on them.
For sure. So what would be your like, if you were to give like Bahamians or even just youth that one-liner or two-liner, what would be the key advice that you would give them so that they can, I guess, start the change, right, in helping the country work against climate change? What would be that one piece of advice you would give?
Do it afraid.
Can you elaborate? Do it afraid.
Climate change is scary, and a lot of people are sort of, their reaction is like frozen when they really begin to understand and appreciate the impacts and the severity of the impacts and what that means for us as a small island country. That means we're going to lose a lot of our resources, a lot of our cultural resources, a lot of, the benefits and things that we're used to. And how do we mitigate against that? Because again, when we look at our political leadership, like that changes about every 5 years, but climate change is like 100-year problem, right? So we can't, I'm not saying our leadership isn't doing anything about it, but I'm saying we shouldn't look to them ultimately to solve this problem for us. We have to mobilize ourselves to make the change if we're really invested in protecting our communities. And so there is something that you can do about it. But again, there's strength and unity in numbers, right? So let's get together, let's come up with some plans for our communities. And yeah, we have to do it afraid. Like, being frozen by fear is not an option because we don't know when the next Dorian is going to hit, right?
Yeah.
So we just have to do it afraid. Inaction is not an option. It's not an option. So we have to do everything we can now.
That's actually really good advice. And I think there are a lot of people who aren't afraid yet, but at least having conversations like this can spark the awareness, right? Like, to get people aware that this is not just some distant, far away thing. Like you always say, not well, always, like everyone's been pointing out, right? Dorian is a classic example of how we're on the curve of starting to get these types of storms that are awful. And if we don't try to start making steps, then our children, grandchildren, and their grandchildren are going to start suffering more storms like this. So by making small steps to big changes in your daily life, you can help everyone, the country, mitigate against climate change. So I definitely am so happy that you took some time out on your beautiful Easter Sunday to chat with me. Definitely have to bring you back for some more stuff because you were starting to give some really good advice that I think you probably have a lot more. So we definitely need to have one on like practical, sustainable living tips to help mitigate climate change. But yeah, this is great. I'm really happy that I got you here to talk about some of this stuff. And I don't think there are any other questions. Nope, I don't see any questions. Did you have any other final thoughts that you wanted to give to our audience?
Sure. So I just wanted to just let everybody know I am working on some projects with the government right now, and there is some progress being made with Dorian in terms of the recovery. I'm asking everybody to be patient because I know where everything was sort of wiped out in 1 to 2 days, we sort of want everybody to work with the same urgency. And it's not that we're not, it's just that there's so many things that have to be put in place appropriately, right? To make sure that, God forbid, if we have to experience something like that again, we're in a better position than we were before when it happened, right? So just reminding everybody to please be patient. These things take time, but policies are being developed, right? Regulations are being put in place, and we are going to, quote unquote, build back better. Like, we're committed to that. I know for sure, like my team at Braun, we are committed to that, and we're gonna do our part to contribute and make sure that the Bahamas is prepared.
That is awesome. So thank you so much again. You were my season finale, and I think this was a beautiful episode to have as that season 3 wrap up. So yeah, thank you for taking some time out. Thank you to everyone who's been watching and tuning in all season, and even for this last one, because you could be doing anything else today, especially today, but you chose to be here and watch this episode with us. So thanks for tuning in, and remember, it's not ocean. I'm like messing with my thoughts now. The ocean isn't what separates us, is what connects us. I will see you all back here again in about a month for season 4, which will be a special edition. So stay tuned and keep up with all of the great things we are doing. Like, some cleanups are coming out. April is Earth Day is coming this month. So this is Earth Month. So stay tuned for a lot of great things that myself and Kelli Ashley will be doing. And have a wonderful Sunday.
Bye, everybody.